On the 25th day of July in 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief west of German forces, stood before Adolf Hitler and the assembled leadership of the Third Reich to deliver an assessment of Germany's strategic position in France that shocked those present with its brutal honesty. The Field Marshal, a product of Prussian military tradition and a veteran of both world wars, had spent the previous 7 weeks watching the carefully constructed German defensive system in northern France collapse under the weight of Allied material superiority and tactical innovation. His recommendation to the assembled leadership was stark and unambiguous. Germany should seek terms with the Western Allies before the military situation deteriorated beyond salvage. This moment, occurring just 25 days after the Allied landings at Normandy, represented not merely the opinion of one senior commander, but rather the culmination of a month of catastrophic reversals that had convinced multiple German field commanders that the war in the West could no longer be won through military means. The story of how Germany's military leadership arrived at this conclusion requires examination of the battles fought between the 6th of June and the end of July 1944. The widening gap between Hitler's strategic vision and battlefield reality, and the ultimately futile attempts by professional military officers to inject realism into German strategic planning during the final year of the Second World War. The German military position in France on the morning of June 6, 1944, was substantially weaker than Allied intelligence estimated, though this weakness was not immediately apparent during the initial phases of the Normandy invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B under von Rundstedt's overall authority, had spent the previous months attempting to strengthen coastal defenses according to his conviction that the invasion must be defeated on the beaches during the first 24 hours. Rommel's experience in North Africa had convinced him that Allied air superiority would make it impossible to maneuver large armored formations once the invasion commenced. Therefore, German mobile reserves must be positioned close to likely landing areas. Von Rundstedt disagreed with this assessment, believing instead that a strong mobile reserve held inland could counterattack once the Allies had revealed their main effort. This fundamental disagreement over operational doctrine had never been resolved, resulting in a compromise that satisfied neither commander. German armored divisions were scattered across France in positions that left them too far from the coast to intervene during the critical first hours, yet too close to be immune from Allied air interdiction when they attempted to move forward. The 7th Army under General Friedrich Dollmann held the Normandy coastline with infantry divisions of varying quality, many composed of older soldiers or troops recovering from wounds suffered on the Eastern Front. The strongest divisions, including the 352nd Infantry Division occupying positions along Omaha Beach, were well-trained formations, but overall, German strength in Normandy was inadequate for the length of coastline that required defense. When Allied airborne troops began landing shortly after midnight on June 6th, followed by amphibious landings at dawn across 5 beaches, the German response was hampered by command confusion, communication breakdowns, and the absence of key commanders. Rommel himself was in Germany visiting his wife for her birthday, having judged that weather conditions made an invasion unlikely during early June. Von Rundstedt, at his headquarters in Paris, received fragmentary reports throughout the night, but hesitated to commit armored reserves without clearer intelligence about whether the Normandy landings represented the main Allied effort or a diversion preceding a larger assault at the Pas de Calais. This hesitation, reinforced by Hitler's own insistence on retaining personal control over panzer deployments, meant that German armored formations did not begin moving toward Normandy until the afternoon of June 6th, by which time Allied forces had established themselves ashore at most landing beaches. The exception was Omaha Beach, where the American 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division encountered the strongest German defenses and suffered the heaviest casualties of D-Day. For several hours, the outcome at Omaha remained uncertain, with German forces inflicting severe losses on assault waves struggling to cross the beach. Had similar resistance been encountered at other landing sites, the invasion might have been contained at the waterline. Instead, British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches pushed inland against lighter opposition, while American forces at Utah Beach advanced with relatively light casualties after landing in the wrong sector away from the strongest German positions. By nightfall, on June 6th, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had come ashore in Normandy, suffering total casualties of roughly 10,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. German casualties for the first day are more difficult to establish with precision, but historians estimate between 4,000 and 9,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured on D-Day. More significantly, the German 7th Army had failed to contain the invasion on the beaches, and Allied forces held a continuous lodgment across most of the invasion front. The critical question facing German commanders on June 7th was whether armored counterattacks could drive the Allies back into the sea before they could reinforce and consolidate their beachhead. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed largely of young volunteers from the Hitler Youth Organization and representing one of the better-equipped German armored formations in France, reached positions north of Caen on June 7th and immediately launched attacks against Canadian forces advancing inland from Juno Beach. These attacks achieved local tactical successes, preventing Canadian forces from capturing Caen on D-Day as Allied planners had optimistically projected, but they could not dislodge Allied forces from positions already secured. Throughout the following week, additional German armored divisions, including the Panzer Lehr Division and the 2nd Panzer Division, moved into Normandy, but their approach marches were severely disrupted by Allied air attacks. The Panzer Lehr Division, moving from positions south of the Loire River, required 5 days to cover a distance that should have required 2 days under normal conditions, suffering significant losses of vehicles and equipment to airstrikes during daylight hours. Von Rundstedt and Rommel recognized by mid-June that the opportunity to destroy the Allied beachhead through immediate counterattack had passed. Allied forces controlled sufficient port facilities, including the artificial Mulberry harbors, to sustain their buildup of forces faster than German reinforcements could arrive. The Allies enjoyed complete air superiority over the battlefield, making large-scale German maneuvers during daylight virtually impossible. Allied naval gunfire provided devastating support for ground operations, with battleships and cruisers positioned off the coast, delivering fire with a weight and accuracy that German artillery could not match. Under these conditions, von Rundstedt and Rommel shifted to a strategy of static defense, attempting to contain the Allied lodgment within a perimeter running roughly from Caen through Caumont to the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. This defensive strategy might have been sustainable in the short term, but it could not prevent the eventual Allied breakout given the fundamental imbalance of resources. The Allies could replace losses and expand their forces, while German replacements arrived in inadequate numbers and often consisted of poorly trained troops. German fuel supplies grew increasingly tight as Allied air forces targeted transportation infrastructure throughout France. Artillery ammunition, always in shorter supply than German commanders desired, had to be rationed carefully. The Germans fought with considerable tactical skill, using terrain skillfully and conducting counterattacks that inflicted significant casualties on Allied forces, but the overall trajectory of the campaign pointed toward inevitable German defeat unless strategic conditions changed dramatically. The Battle for Caen illustrated both German tactical competence and the impossibility of their strategic situation. British forces under General Bernard Montgomery attempted repeatedly during June to capture Caen, a city of approximately 50,000 inhabitants that sat astride key road networks needed for Allied operations. Montgomery launched Operation Epsom on June 26, attempting to envelop Caen from the west by crossing the Odon River and seizing high ground beyond. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, including the 9th SS Panzer Division and 10th SS Panzer Division, transferred from the Eastern Front, counterattacked against British forces that had penetrated German lines, preventing a breakthrough. British forces suffered approximately 4,000 casualties during Operation Epsom, while German losses totaled perhaps 3,000 casualties, though exact figures remain disputed. The operation achieved limited territorial gains, but failed to capture Caen or decisively rupture German defenses. Montgomery launched another major offensive, Operation Charnwood, on July 8, this time attacking Caen directly from the north, following a massive aerial bombardment that dropped approximately 2,400 tons of bombs on the northern sections of the city. British and Canadian forces finally entered Caen on July 9th, though German forces retained positions south of the Orne River, meaning the city was only partially captured. These battles consumed German reserves and inflicted losses that could not be replaced, but they also demonstrated that Allied superiority was not so overwhelming that German positions would simply collapse without prolonged fighting. While British and Canadian forces struggled to capture Caen, American forces in the western sector of the Normandy Lodgement fought through the distinctive bocage terrain of the Cotentin Peninsula and advanced toward the port city of Cherbourg. The bocage consisted of small fields divided by thick hedgerows built up over centuries, creating terrain that heavily favored defensive operations. German forces fought delaying actions from hedgerow to hedgerow, exacting a high price for each incremental American advance. The American First Army under General Omar Bradley required 3 weeks of hard fighting to cross the Cotentin Peninsula and isolate Cherbourg, suffering roughly 40,000 casualties in the process. American forces captured Cherbourg on June 27th, after General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commanding the garrison, surrendered following several days of house-to-house fighting. German engineers had demolished port facilities before surrendering, requiring weeks of Allied engineering work before Cherbourg could function as a supply port. The capture of Cherbourg eliminated German control of any significant port in Normandy, further reducing German logistical sustainability, but it came at the cost of casualties that shocked American commanders and raised questions about whether the bocage fighting could be sustained indefinitely. Von Rundstedt observed these battles from his headquarters and concluded by late June that the military situation in Normandy was deteriorating toward catastrophe. German forces were fighting effectively at the tactical level, inflicting substantial casualties on Allied forces and preventing rapid Allied advances, but the strategic mathematics were inexorable. The Allies could sustain their offensive because they controlled the sea and air, possessed virtually unlimited supplies, and could replace casualties. Germany could do none of these things in sufficient quantity to alter the campaign's trajectory. Von Rundstedt's assessment was shared by Rommel, who had grown increasingly pessimistic about German prospects as June progressed. Both field marshals understood that Germany faced a two-front war it could not win, with Soviet forces preparing a massive summer offensive in the east, while Allied forces in the west could not be dislodged from France. The question facing German military leadership was not whether Germany could win the war through military means, but rather whether political leadership would acknowledge this reality and seek terms before Germany suffered complete military collapse. Hitler summoned von Rundstedt and Rommel to meet with him at the Berghof near Berchtesgaden on June 29th, seeking their assessment of the situation in France and the prospects for operations to restore German control of Normandy. The meeting occurred 3 weeks after D-Day, by which time the impossibility of defeating the invasion through immediate counterattack was apparent to both field marshals. Von Rundstedt and Rommel presented a bleak but accurate assessment of German capabilities and Allied strength. They explained that German forces were fighting skillfully but could not prevent eventual Allied breakout from the lodgement area. They described the crippling effects of Allied air superiority on German mobility and logistics. They detailed the loss rates among German units and the inadequacy of replacements. Both commanders advocated for a fundamental shift in German strategy in the West, suggesting that forces in Normandy should conduct a fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions further inland, shortening German lines and potentially preserving forces for defense of Germany itself. Hitler rejected these recommendations completely. He insisted that every meter of French territory must be held, that withdrawal was unacceptable, and that German forces would launch counteroffensives to drive the Allies back into the sea. When von Rundstedt attempted to explain that such counteroffensives were not feasible given available German resources and Allied air superiority, Hitler dismissed these concerns as defeatism. The meeting at the Berghof on June 29th marked a critical moment in the relationship between Hitler and his field commanders in the West. Von Rundstedt left the meeting convinced that Hitler either did not understand or refused to acknowledge the military realities in France. The field marshal returned to Paris and continued attempting to manage an impossible situation, allocating inadequate resources to contain an enemy that grew stronger daily. The gap between Hitler's strategic vision and battlefield reality had grown so wide that meaningful dialogue between political and military leadership became impossible. This situation was not new in German military history, recalling similar tensions during the First World War when the German High Command struggled against imperial political leadership over war aims and strategy, but it had become more acute by summer 1944 because Germany's strategic position was manifestly hopeless to professional military officers, even as Hitler insisted that will and determination would produce victory. On July 1st, just 2 days after the contentious meeting at the Berghof, von Rundstedt engaged in a telephone conversation with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces High Command. Keitel inquired about the situation in Normandy and asked what actions German forces should take. Von Rundstedt's response, according to accounts that vary somewhat in specific wording but agree in substance, was that Germany should make peace. When Keitel asked what should be done, von Rundstedt reportedly replied with words to the effect of, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" This exchange, whether or not recorded with perfect accuracy, reflected von Rundstedt's conviction that Germany had no military solution to its strategic predicament and that political leadership had a responsibility to acknowledge this reality before the situation deteriorated further. The conversation reached Hitler within hours. On July 2nd, von Rundstedt was relieved of command as Commander-in-Chief West, replaced by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, an officer Hitler believed would be more aggressive and optimistic about German offensive prospects in Normandy. Von Rundstedt's removal from command did not change the military situation in France. Von Kluge arrived in Normandy in early July, expecting to find opportunities for offensive operations that would restore German control of the campaign. Instead, he encountered the same impossible conditions that had convinced von Rundstedt that military victory was unattainable. Allied forces continued building up their strength faster than German reinforcements arrived. Allied air forces maintained complete dominance of the skies over Normandy, making daylight movement of German forces extraordinarily difficult. German fuel stocks dwindled as Allied aircraft targeted transportation networks throughout France. The quality of German replacements declined, as the best soldiers had already been committed to Normandy or were needed on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces launched their summer offensive, Operation Bagration, on June 23rd. This massive Soviet attack in Belorussia destroyed German Army Group Center, inflicting perhaps 350,000 German casualties and advancing Soviet forces hundreds of kilometers westward. Germany now faced simultaneous catastrophes on both fronts, with no reserves adequate to stabilize either theater. Von Kluge retained his optimism for perhaps 2 weeks. He met with Rommel and other senior commanders, inspected forward positions, and received briefings on German capabilities and Allied strength. By mid-July, von Kluge reached conclusions identical to those that had prompted von Rundstedt's dismissal. The military situation in Normandy was hopeless unless strategic conditions changed dramatically. German forces could continue fighting effectively at the tactical level, inflicting casualties and delaying Allied advances, but they could not prevent eventual Allied breakout and the subsequent loss of France. Von Kluge began sending pessimistic reports to Berlin, describing the deteriorating German position and the impossibility of launching the counter-offensives Hitler continued to demand. These reports received the same reception von Rundstedt's assessments had encountered. Hitler insisted that determination and aggressive action would produce victory regardless of material imbalances. The 25th day after D-Day, which corresponds to July 1st, 1944, therefore represents the approximate moment when von Rundstedt concluded that Germany must seek peace terms and communicated this assessment to the German High Command through his conversation with Keitel. However, the broader narrative of German military pessimism regarding the Normandy campaign extended across several weeks during late June and early July, with multiple senior commanders reaching similar conclusions about Germany's inability to win the campaign through military means. Rommel himself composed a memorandum on July 15th detailing the impossible military situation facing German forces in France and implicitly arguing for a political settlement. This memorandum, addressed to Hitler through military channels, described German losses that could not be replaced, detailed the effects of Allied material superiority, and concluded that German forces in Normandy faced eventual destruction unless the political situation changed. Rommel stopped short of explicitly recommending that Germany seek peace terms, but his memorandum's logic pointed clearly toward that conclusion. The memorandum reached Hitler on July 17th, the same day that Rommel was severely wounded when British aircraft strafed his staff car, removing him from active command. The question of why von Rundstedt and other German field commanders believed in late June and early July that Germany should seek peace terms requires examination of what alternatives these officers perceived as available. From the perspective of professional military officers trained in the Prussian tradition of realistic strategic assessment, Germany's position by July 1944 was hopeless. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly in the east following the destruction of Army Group Center. Allied forces in Italy had captured Rome on June 4th and were advancing northward. Allied forces in France could not be dislodged and would inevitably break out of Normandy, leading to the liberation of France and Allied advance toward Germany. Germany's production of war materials, though still substantial, could not match combined Allied production. German cities faced increasing devastation from Allied strategic bombing. German fuel supplies grew tighter as Romanian oil fields came under threat from advancing Soviet forces. Under these conditions, professional military logic suggested that Germany should seek terms with the Western Allies before the military situation deteriorated to the point where no negotiating leverage remained. Some German officers, including elements of the resistance movement that culminated in the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler, believed that a post-Hitler German government might negotiate acceptable terms with the Western Allies, possibly even securing Western support against Soviet advances in the East. These calculations proved entirely divorced from political reality. The Allied policy of unconditional surrender, announced by Roosevelt and Churchill at Casablanca in January 1943 and reaffirmed at subsequent conferences, meant that no negotiated settlement was available regardless of German military setbacks. The Western Allies had no intention of making separate peace with Germany that would betray the Soviet Union, and Stalin had no interest in allowing Germany to survive as a significant power. The alliance against Germany, despite tensions and competing post-war visions among the Allies, remained firm on the fundamental point that Germany must be completely defeated and occupied. German military officers who believed that Germany should seek peace terms were therefore advocating for something that was not diplomatically available, though this did not necessarily mean their military assessments were incorrect. Germany would indeed suffer complete military collapse. German cities would be reduced to rubble. Millions more soldiers and civilians would die, and Germany would ultimately surrender unconditionally in May 1945. Whether an earlier German attempt to negotiate would have produced better outcomes remains a counterfactual historical question. But the military officers who advocated for seeking terms in July 1944 were correct that Germany could not win the war through continued fighting. The assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20, 1944, by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and other conspirators within the German military establishment represented the most dramatic effort by German officers to remove Hitler from power, potentially creating conditions for a negotiated end to the war. The conspiracy included numerous senior officers and government officials who believed Hitler's continued leadership guaranteed Germany's destruction. Von Rundstedt was not directly involved in the conspiracy, though historians debate whether he had indirect knowledge of the plot. Rommel's relationship to the conspiracy remains somewhat unclear, with evidence suggesting he supported the idea of removing Hitler, but may not have known specific details of the assassination plan. Von Kluge maintained contact with conspirators, but ultimately did not support the coup attempt when it occurred. The failure of the assassination attempt, Hitler's survival, and the subsequent savage repression of anyone associated with the conspiracy eliminated any remaining possibility of changing German leadership through internal military action. Hitler's control over Germany became absolute during the final months of the war, with no institutional mechanism remaining to challenge his authority or alter German strategy. The battles in Normandy continued throughout July with increasing intensity. Montgomery launched Operation Goodwood on July 18th, a massive armored offensive east of Caen, designed to break through German positions and reach the open country beyond. The operation began with devastating aerial bombardment. Over 2,000 Allied bombers dropping approximately 7,500 tons of bombs on German positions. British armoured divisions then advanced through the bombed areas, achieving initial penetrations of several kilometres against shocked German defenders. German forces, however, recovered from the initial bombardment more quickly than Allied planners anticipated, establishing defensive positions in depth that British armour could not penetrate. The operation ultimately gained roughly 10 kilometres of territory at a cost of approximately 4,000 Allied casualties and the loss of several hundred tanks. German casualties totaled perhaps 2,500 soldiers. Operation Goodwood failed to achieve the breakthrough Montgomery had hoped for, but it accomplished important attritional effects, further degrading German armoured forces defending the Khe Sanh sector and pulling German reserves eastward, which created conditions for the American breakout operation that followed. The American breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, began on July 25th, with concentrated aerial bombardment of German positions at the western end of the Allied lodgment near the town of St. Lo. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and 380 medium bombers dropped approximately 4,000 tons of bombs on a rectangular area roughly 5 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep, attempting to obliterate German defensive positions. The bombing achieved devastating effects against German forces in the target area, but also caused significant friendly fire casualties when bombs fell short of their intended targets, killing over 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action in the European theater. American infantry and armor then advanced through the bombed area, encountering disorganized German resistance. The Panzer Lehr Division, occupying positions in the bombardment zone, effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation, its survivors scattered and its equipment destroyed. American forces pushed through German lines on July 26th and 27th, achieving the breakthrough that had eluded Allied forces for the previous 7 weeks. The German position in Normandy collapsed rapidly following the American breakout at St. Lo. American armored divisions raced westward into Brittany and southward toward the Loire River. Encountering limited German resistance, Hitler ordered a counterattack toward Avranches, attempting to cut off American forces that had broken through German lines, but this counterattack lacked sufficient forces and logistical support to succeed. German armored divisions, launching the counterattack during the night of August 6th and 7th, made limited initial progress, but were stopped by American forces and subjected to devastating air attacks once daylight arrived. The failure of this counterattack left German forces in Normandy exposed to encirclement. Canadian and Polish forces attacked southward from Caen, while American forces turned northward from positions south of the German lines, threatening to trap German forces in a pocket near the town of Falaise. German commanders recognized the danger and began withdrawing forces eastward toward the Seine River, conducting a fighting retreat while attempting to hold open an escape corridor near Falaise. Allied forces closed the Falaise pocket on August 21st, trapping substantial German forces inside the encirclement. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers escaped the pocket before it closed, but roughly 50,000 more were captured, and perhaps 10,000 were killed in the final battles around Falaise. Von Rundstedt watched these catastrophic defeats from his residence in Germany, having been removed from command before the Allied breakout rendered German positions in Normandy untenable. His assessment from July 1st, that Germany should make peace because military victory was impossible, had been validated by subsequent events, though this provided no satisfaction to the Field Marshal. Von Kluge who had replaced von Rundstedt with instructions to be more aggressive and optimistic, reached identical conclusions about Germany's hopeless military position. On August 15th, von Kluge wrote a final letter to Hitler, acknowledging that the war could not be won militarily and implicitly recommending that Germany seek political settlement. Von Kluge then committed suicide on August 19th, apparently believing he would be arrested and executed for suspected connections to the July 20th conspiracy. He was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, who conducted the German retreat from France with considerable skill but could not alter the fundamental reality that German forces had suffered catastrophic defeat in Normandy. The Battle of Normandy cost Germany approximately 400,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. German forces lost virtually all their heavy equipment committed to the Normandy campaign, including approximately 1,500 tanks, 20,000 vehicles, and 500 assault guns. These losses could not be replaced at a time when Germany faced simultaneous crises on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces advanced through Poland toward the German frontier. Allied casualties in Normandy totaled approximately 200,000, including killed, wounded, and missing, but these losses could be replaced from Allied manpower pools that dwarfed German reserves. The liberation of Paris on August 25th and the Allied advance to the German frontier by September demonstrated that von Rundstedt's assessment in July had been accurate. Germany could not win the battle for Normandy through military means, and the subsequent defeats would bring Allied forces to Germany's borders. The historical significance of von Rundstedt's statement to Keitel on July 1st lies not in its immediate effects, which were nil since Hitler rejected any consideration of peace negotiations, but rather in what it reveals about the gap between military and political leadership in Nazi Germany during the final year of the war. Professional military officers, trained to assess strategic situations realistically and recommend courses of action based on available resources and probable outcomes, concluded by July 1944 that Germany had no military path to victory and that political leadership should acknowledge this reality. Hitler and the Nazi political leadership rejected these assessments completely, insisting that determination and will would produce victory regardless of material circumstances. This fundamental disconnect between military realism and political ideology meant that Germany would fight on for another 10 months, suffering millions of additional casualties and seeing German cities reduced to ruins, before finally surrendering unconditionally in May 1945. Whether an earlier German attempt to seek terms would have produced better outcomes remains unknowable, as Allied policy demanded unconditional surrender and provided no basis for negotiation, but the military officers who recognized Germany's hopeless position in July 1944 were correct in their assessment of strategic reality, even if they were naive about political possibilities. Von Rundstedt's blunt statement to Keitel, "Make peace, you fools," captured in a few words the frustration of professional military officers who understood that Germany was losing the war but could not convince political leadership to acknowledge this reality or alter course before the inevitable catastrophe arrived.